Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the Keim Report wherever you get your podcast. You're watching on YouTube. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Ampire Media. That's Ampire. I hope you know that by now. And I hope you know that it's always appreciated when you tune in. Today, I'm joined by Washington Post columnist Barry Svrluga as we discuss the Commanders' ownership situation. But from this standpoint, Barry's been in town for 20 years. Is he surprised that we've gotten to this point with Dan Snyder? When did he think this might actually take place? Also, what would be his advice for the new owner to get the fans back? Is it just about winning? How would he set up an organization? What would he want to see new owner do here? And I think he has some very good thoughts and some interesting thoughts that I think you will enjoy. Anyway, you can follow Barry on Twitter at Barry Svrluga, and it's Svrluga. And you can read his work on WashingtonPost.com, and you can read my work, of course, on ESPN.com. There you go. Before I get to the interview, I got a couple bookkeeping items for players that were here and have left, and also some ownership situation updates. As much as I can provide because what I don't want to do, folks, is add to the speculation shit show. I'll just say it. The speculation shit show that's been going on. I apologize for you kids listening. Anyway, my kids have probably heard worse when I've watched Ohio State, trust me. Anyway, just so you know, so I don't want to add to that, but I do want to provide some level of an update for you based on my reporting. Anyway, let's get to the first things first. First, Cam Sims is now a Las Vegas Raider. Commanders did want to keep him. They did make him an offer. They weren't going to go very high for him. And so it's for Sims, you can go to a team that does not have as many receivers ahead of him as you do here. And I think, maybe more of an opportunity with Washington. They did sign Marcus Kemp, who played with the Chiefs. That didn't necessarily preclude them from keeping Sims. They did make him an offer, but, because they also they had different roles on special teams. Sims is much more of a gunner. That's not Kemp's role. And so I think it wasn't like a 1-for-1 exactly here, but he is a backup receiver, and that's what Sims was. Sims is a much more experienced and more talented receiver, and he's had more catches, and he can also line up and run routes from 3 different spots. I know people over the years say, get him the ball more, give him the ball more. And I always liked him. But now the question is, well, who would you get him the ball ahead of? You have 3 guys ahead of him that if you take them, if you want to get Sims more, you're taking one of those guys out, and those guys are the playmakers. So anyway, good opportunity for Sims to go somewhere else and try to carve out another niche. I admire what that guy has done in this league. He found ways to add value to a team, and that's by being a really good special teams player, a very willing receiver, being able to run routes. Smart receiver can run routes from, again, 3 different spots, and a really good blocker. So there you go. Also, linebacker Anthony Walker visited Washington on Tuesday. No contract. Doesn't appear one is forthcoming or anytime soon. A lot of it was, I think, to really gauge his health. They are still going to look for backup linebackers, and or another quality linebacker to add. You may be able to listen, guys are going to be cut after the draft. So there are going to be some teams that are going to kind of wait, kind of kick the tires on some things and see what happens after the draft, after teams know what they have, where they can cut. And it's also maybe a position you can add in the draft, but you need to get another quality player there because they just haven't had the depth there. And while they have done something there, they signed Cody Barton. Well, they lost Cole Holcomb. So it's a 1-for-1 in terms of the quality that you have at that position. So I do think they want to still add, and they need to. If they don't, it will be a mistake. There you go. Now you know my thoughts. As far as the ownership situation goes, there's been, I would just say, I continue to say, be careful with what you're seeing. And I would also say that there's a lot of us who are working on this story who aren't reporting a lot of things right now. Just keep that in mind. So let's go back to what we know. And also, a lot of people are trying to connect dots that I think they're kind of, I think there's some stretches here with this dot connecting. I mean, it's getting to be it's silly season here, folks. And I think the dot connecting is part of that. So let's go back to what we know. And here, the dots that I think are more connectable, or the ones that maybe matter more, are what's happening with the Josh Harris group over the last several weeks. First of all, they added Mitchell Rayos about 3 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. a DC billionaire. So what does that do? It satisfies the money, anything financially, because obviously the Harris Group can afford to buy this team, but what do they then do with the stadium? Well, now you have another billionaire on board that you have more money available, right? Magic Johnson comes on Monday, it comes out that he's been added to their group. Now, he was part of their group when they bid for the Denver Broncos and failed to get him. So it's not like his inclusion is some automatic, oh, now it's over. But I do think it was the Harris Group strengthening their group, if nothing else. And Magic, both these guys, Rails and Magic Johnson, would be limited partners. Harris is the controlling owner. He's the guy with the say. Limited partners don't have any say. But I think a guy like Magic is good. He does have good business acumen, and he's a proven winner, leader, but he's not going to be sitting there calling in hey, Ron, you got to draft this guy in the third round. Or go sign this guy. Not going to be his role, folks. Not a football guy. So, but he is a good businessman and a good leader. And I think it's good to have him as part of an organization if that's where it goes. And for what it's worth, I've heard good things about Harris from impartial observers. And that, as far as an owner, and he's got a track record. And I asked Barry about how important is that, but one of the things you would hear about him is a desire to go out and hire quality people. He's not a big meddler, he's not a big guy with the media. So I think he'd be, if he does indeed get it, I wouldn't expect him to be out there in front of the media talking to us all that often, maybe once a year or so. But I have heard good things about him as an owner and his approach and who the kind of people he looks for. We'll see if it transfers, if that's indeed where it goes. And, again, absolutely nothing is official at this point. The other group that we know is Tillman Fertitta, and that's the only other group that we know for sure that has bid on them. The other two groups who toured the facilities remain anonymous. That's what we know as far as that goes. Now, here's what else we know. The owners' meetings are taking place in Phoenix. People arrive starting on Sunday, and they'll be there. There have been times in the past that it spills into Wednesday. I don't know that that's going to happen this time around. It has not been happening the last several years. Usually Goodell wraps it up with the Tuesday afternoon press conference, and I'm kind of anticipating the same thing this time. So will there be, first of all, here's the other thing. There will not be a vote, no vote on this franchise next week, period. That was never going to happen. It would have been way too soon. So all the talk about, even when free agency started, they knew when free agency started that there would not be a vote on this ownership situation until late May at the earliest. So the owners will meet again in late May. I think it's the 22nd to the 24th. That's the next time that would be the earliest that vote would be taking place on whatever group is eventually announced. Could there be an ownership announcement at the meetings next week? Well, it depends. I would say, I think there is, again, I don't want to contribute to the wild or whatever speculation, so I'm trying to be very careful with what I say. But I don't think anything gets announced this week. Now, as far as when you talk to people about next week, I still think there's skepticism that that anything would be announced next week. Could it happen? Sure. That I think people know in this process, it's kind of like some people have called it a little bit atypical. So could Dan Snyder decide over the weekend that, hey, boom, this is it. Boom, let's go. Sure. I don't know. But again, there's skepticism. And I would say the Washington Post has reported some of that same stuff. And I know Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer also has reported some of that same stuff too. And I think so I'm in line with that, with the caveat that some people here have said, well, you never know, or something, could it change? Sure. So that's where we're at. So I would go in there. I'm not going to go in there. If I were you, I would just, again, be careful with everything that you're seeing, and just know when there is the news, when there's the big news, it will get out and it will be reported. So there you go. I hope that helps. Anyway, let's get to my conversation with the Washington Post, Barry Svrluga. Well, Barry, we're not at the point where we know who the owner is going to be. So we're going to stick with what we can discuss, which is, impact down the road. We know this team's going to be sold. When it is, who knows? But I am curious, first of all, how long have you been in Washington and covering sports in this area?
I got here in '03, so this summer is my 20th anniversary.
Wow. So almost the entire reign of Dan Snyder.
Almost.
I've been blessed to cover the entire reign, I guess I'll say. But I am curious. So again, you've been here a long time then. Are you surprised that we're even at this point? I know this has been going on for four months now. So, but are you surprised we're at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who knows, I can't say that I know Dan Snyder to sit down and have a chat with him because he hasn't made himself available like that, but knows how this franchise has worked and really kind of what a combative, defiant character he has been, kind of walling himself off, not just from us in the media, which is totally fine, but also from, if you talk to other people who've been involved in sports here for a long time, he's not been kind of in that community, in those circles, and has really just kind of been on an island. And, you go back, John, to his defiance about changing the name,
Right.
you will never, all caps, all that kind of thing. Obviously that had to change, but I just never thought that he would be essentially backed into a corner where the confluence of the court of public opinion, his own financial situation, his own legal situation, kind of all came together to put him in position to say, I know I grew up rooting for this team. It was my dream to win a championship like I saw when I was growing up, and get to the point where he's like, essentially, I give up.
When did you start to think that it might get to this point? Because it's really hard even for me to pinpoint when you're like, oh, there's a chance that.
I I don't know about you, but until the release came out or the story initially that they had hired the bank to look into the possibilities, I was not saying I think he's going to sell until that happened.
Right.
It's just I think for me, like, there's a built-in kind of bludgeoned into you skepticism or pessimism around this franchise that anything positive could happen, because even in the blips of positivity that maybe it's RG3's rookie season or when Cousins looked like he might be maybe was a franchise quarterback, even in those little blips, I think we have been conditioned to, well, there's something around the corner that we don't know about yet, and it's going to turn bad. And that's not trying to be overly negative. That's just, what the history was, how the place works, and it always happens that way. So
Okay.
even as Dan Snyder was being investigated by, pick the list, the NFL, different attorneys general, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Congress, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is going to ultimately be good because he'll come to the realization that the best thing for all parties is for him to sell, because it almost seemed like too good to be true.
As a columnist who's been covering it, because first of all, you transitioned from writer to columnist. You actually covered the team for a couple of years. Was it a couple? It was a couple of years. Yeah, four. Was
Two
it
Zorn
4
years and the first two Shanahan years. Yeah.
Oh, you were out here for 4 years?
Yeah. That's for you. That's like a season.
Well, the last couple have felt like 4 years apiece.
Sure.
So yeah, I didn't realize you were out here for that long. I knew it was, I know it was probably the best time of your life, but
exactly.
But the Zorn years, the 2 Zorn years, that actually you should probably get more than 1 year's credit for each one of those.
Oh, those were wild. And I think that, when we talk about what are the craziest franchise to cover, whatever's in front of you seems more bizarre. But I think in terms of NFL teams, like, you'd put this franchise up against probably the New York Jets as a franchise where just like you wake up every day and you don't know what's going to happen. And I will always say that to demonstrate the weirdness of this franchise, that pulling a guy out of a nursing home where he was calling bingo games and having him call plays in an NFL game the next week, like, that's peak Redskins Commanders Washington football team. It doesn't get a lot weirder than that. And that actually happened.
And it did. And the funny thing is, in the pantheon of all this, it kind of it's one of those, like, even in the last couple of years, you're like, it's blah, blah, blah happened and blah, blah, blah. And oh yeah, the DEA raided their facility. There's
Right.
always, it gets a little bit lost, but it was crazy. And I also remember, and we're going to get back to the ownership stuff in a minute, but I remember when we were doing the little presser with, was it Sherman Smith, right? Or
Sherman Lewis was the guy they brought
Sherman
in.
Smith was already there. Sherman Lewis, right? So when we were talking with him outside the building, and that question came up, and the look on the faces of some of the team officials are like, "Oh no."
They didn't realize it. It was amazing. Like, I mean, the question was natural. Like, what were you doing last week? Well, on bingo games at a nursing home. Yeah. So anyway,
yeah,
wild times.
It was wild times. And so, but that's how we get here. So how much do you think, again, in your role, you're an observer now and you cover everything. How much do you think all that stuff has just worn down this area? And how have you seen the popularity of this franchise go from when you got here to where it is now?
So, I mean, it's such a great question and a really good topic that could fill like an hour because, I think there really was a wait list for season tickets. This really was a pillar NFL franchise. That in the 80s and early 90s, people wanted to come here, and it did, bond a town that in a lot of ways, by definition, is just kind of divided because there's D's and R's, and that's kind of what makes the town chug along. And the football team, particularly when there was not a baseball team here, had a unifying effect. And there were such warm feelings around RFK and the stands bouncing, and that being the place to be, and it being a hard ticket. To see, it's almost unfathomable to see the erosion of the fan base and a generation of like people my age, my friends who grew up here and had such great memories of going to those games or watching those games on TVs and the Super Bowls and all of that, try to bring up their own kids as fans of this team. And a lot of them are like, why would I do that? Why would I put myself through that? That nothing good ever happens here. It's a very hard, it's not a good experience at the stadium, as we've talked about a million times. There's not a lot to grab onto. So it really has, we know that the wait list became fictitious after a while. We know that they've covered seats at FedEx Field and made the capacity less rather than larger. All of that is very, very real. And it's one of the reasons why I think an ownership, in my time here, the biggest sports of things that have happened are, I think, inarguably the Caps winning the Cup in 2018, the Nats winning the World Series in 2019, baseball returning in 2005. And then you throw in like, okay, Maryland winning the national title in 2002, something like that. I think an ownership change of the football team would become the most significant sports story of this century in Washington, because you take something immediately that feels that it is limited in its possibilities, that there's not any optimism around, and it immediately pivots back to, okay, wow, now maybe things could change. Now, it doesn't mean you found the quarterback long term. It doesn't mean you know who the coach should be going forward. But the one thing that was limiting this thing more than anything else would be changed. And I just think that would just be a monumental difference for the town as a sports town.
Do you think, I mean, this would be certainly the biggest story since I've covered the beat, and I've covered the team since 1994. I mean, this is because just the reaction of the fan base when this is official, when it's officially over, I think it's going to be seismic.
Yeah. I mean, people are talking about, and I think only half jokingly, like, is there going to be a parade on Constitution Avenue when the ownership change goes through? It shows you that, there are plenty of franchises whose fan bases don't like the owner. They don't spend enough, they're cheap, the ticket prices went up, the beer's warm, whatever it is. This is the unifying thing about this fan base is its hatred of the owner, the shirts that say sell the team, the chants that say sell the team, Tanya Snyder getting booed when she's doing a charitable appearance, and that stuff that is like probably makes it hard for the Snyder family to process, like, what joy are they getting out of this anymore? They haven't won. Nobody likes them around here. It's just it's amazing, amazing evolution, or almost, kind of just down the ramp of a franchise that was once so proud and so important.
And I just, and people that I talk to, clearly in my job or in this role, how worn down people are by everything that has happened and continue to happen, in addition to the fact that you're not winning. So like the fact you're not winning, you have that lane over here, and then it's like people used to be, you're proud to say you're a Redskin fan or whatever, and then it's like, well, what is it that you can claim, that you can hold on to with this franchise?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And that's why, and that's really why. I mean, I think it's kind of every year you go to training camp and you have to write, like, well, what are they going to do on the left side of the line? And do they need an upgraded linebacker? And did this first round pick work out? I mean, that's all, important in the moment. But it really felt like there was a hard cap on what this franchise could do with this owner in place, because he had stunted and careers and interfered with coaches and all that kind of stuff. Those aren't just stories. That stuff really happens. And I mean, you remember my colleague and friend Sally Jenkins, I think, really writing more than a decade ago about the effects of toxic management. And it's wear and tear on a workforce in a building where it's not a positive place to, people have cycled through there. That matters. So it's a very, very limiting factor, the fact that Dan Snyder owned and ran this team.
Right. And like I said, I think there was a pride that you just haven't seen in a long time.
For
and
sure.
I think there are people desperately want to get it back. And it is funny, Barry, because I remember telling people, even when Gibbs came here and they started to like, okay, Gibbs can turn this around. Gibbs can turn around. And I remember having numerous conversations with people on my street. I'm like, the minute he goes, it goes back to what it was. The minute he goes, because he's not like, you're leaving knowledge, but you're not leaving the same infrastructure, because you're keeping the same guys in place. And it's just like, I just never felt like they could sustain with him unless you got a quarterback like a Griffin, who you thought would be here for a while. But short of that, it was always going to be hard for anybody who came here.
And I also think, how many people have walked in that building and, X number of years later walked out with their reputation enhanced as a better, more upstanding, I mean, there have been players who have survived and people don't question their commitment or their work ethic or whatever. But, Mike Shanahan came here to embellish a Hall of Fame resume and try to get into Canton, and he's not going to get in because of what happened here. And he's not the only one on that list. And I'm not saying that some of those people aren't at fault themselves, that they should take ownership on what happened while it was on their watch. But it's a very difficult place to enhance a career. Scott McLuhan, did he look better on the way out than he did on the way in? We could go down the list. It's the commonality in it is the guy who owns the team, and it's hard after 20 something years to look away from that, to escape that.
And when he bought the team, and I remember sitting in executives' offices and saying, like, they like his aggressiveness, they like this, but they were never sure if he knew how to put together a team. And a team includes executives around you and people that you surround yourself with, not just the players. And that was always a concern as well.
Well, and also the ability to be a listener, to know what you don't know, to hire people that aren't just yes men, that you trust their opinion, their experience, their work. And maybe that's happened in this last shift of front office. We're in the midstream and we don't really know, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that when you disagree with Daniel Snyder, that's not part of a constructive conversation. That's like, okay, you're out. Because that was the behavior over a long period of time.
Right. And lately it has been a lot different, but I think because there's been so much other stuff going on that it's kind of forced some things the other way. And I think this group has been let alone more than others have been in the past. So it had, so there is that, but you had 2 decades before this where there was a lot of evidence. So, but that's rehashed. Let's look ahead then. Like, what can a new owner do to get back this fan base? And how long do you think it would take? Is it just winning?
I mean, I think winning is such a huge thing, but you start on day one as your greatest attribute is you're not Dan Snyder. Like like that is your biggest strength. And I think it would be very, very smart for any new owner to have a direct conversation with the fan base, to be very forward facing and say, I know what this thing was. I know that it's not what it was. And we together are going to push it forward. Now, winning, it's not going to, if the first 5 seasons are, 5-12, 5-12, and 5, all that, then that's not going to work. The winning has to come. But I think there would just be so much initial enthusiasm from people who were like, I'm never giving Dan Snyder another dollar.
Right.
That doesn't mean they'd all come rushing back and they'd all buy season tickets and there would be, a mad dash. I'm sure there will be some, okay, you got to show me, like, I've been burned before, like, make me buy in. But just not being Dan Snyder would be such a strong suit. And then understanding that and doing some of the things that Snyder didn't do, listen to the fans, engage with the fans. Don't just write letters and post them on the website or send emails. Like, really be out there and be part of the community and listen to the fan base in a way that they feel like you share their pain if it's losing and you're with them, not against them, which it really felt like that at times.
It did. And so I'm curious then too, like, Dan Snyder is obviously a local kid. It was a local kid, grew up rooting for this franchise. But after this last couple of years, these last few decades, is it important? Like Josh Harris and Mitchell Rales, clearly grew up in this area. Is that important? Do you think that's important? And I know, like, I say that knowing that Dan Snyder was that guy, and look what's happened. But is that important after him?
Well, I think people who grew up here and are from here and want to root for the local teams here, you'd always prefer someone local, because then it's not a carpetbagger situation. Right. Like, oh, would they move the team like that? It takes that away. But I think the fan base is smart enough to know that if you grew up as a fan of the team, that can be a plus. It can't be a plus to run the team like a fan. Like, you have to run it like a business. And not a business like a cold business, like it's I always criticize the Naps owners, the learners, for the baseball team is not a mall. Like, you have to run it with caring and some emotion, because that's Sunday afternoons are about emotion and investing your finances, your emotions, and your time in that team. But you have to be able to these guys are successful in business for reasons, not because they made decisions based on emotions. They have to run an NFL team professionally and hire professionals. And like I said before, know what you don't know and hire people who do know that and listen to them and steer the ship together, not in a way that, you're like with a pom-pom and like, let's go sign the flashiest thing. Like, no, let's build the team together.
And, and it's funny because of the groups that we know, like the Josh Harris group, I think he probably embodies that a little bit more, but I don't, still a ways to go here. But I do think because he's got that ownership background, how important is that to have, I'm now Tillman Fertitta also owns the Rockets too. So you can look at their backgrounds and kind of measure for yourself how you think they'll handle things.
Yeah. And I think it's risky because it's natural to make those comparisons and to try to learn something from how they've run other things, but the sports are different. I mean, NBA contracts are guaranteed and NFL ones aren't. And,
True.
The caps work differently. Roster construction is different. And I mean, look at Ted Leonsis. Like, most Capitals fans would say Ted Leonsis is a good owner. He signed the best player in franchise history forever and ever and ever. They won a Stanley Cup. They've been in the playoffs. I think it's 14 out of the last 15 years. Yes, there's been disappointments lately, but they're constantly in the conversation. The same person owns the Wizards, and that hasn't worked out on that side. They have been largely irrelevant. They don't sell out the building. So, it can work out differently in different sports for the same owner. We're gonna if it's one of these guys that has owned a team in another sport elsewhere, we're certainly going to examine their records and their decision making in that. But I don't think it necessarily means he's absolutely going to be a success or a failure in the NFL because he failed or was a success in the NBA or the NHL.
And that's a good point. You know what will determine a lot of that success? Do you get the quarterback or not? Do you get the right quarterback? And I mean, shoot, like if Sam Howell goes out and plays well, then they could be good this year. And, and if a new guy comes in and you get the right coach with the right quarterback, you could be pretty good.
Yes. And that's why, I'd go back to that point about what do we talk about in training camp, all these little small machinations. Like I feel like for years I've had like a 2-note xylophone in front of me banging on these 2 notes. One is quarterback. The other is owner.
Yeah.
There's no other notes to play unless those are fixed. You're on the brink of having the more important of those two fixed. The Howell thing is interesting because he's the guy in the chair at the moment. And we all know, like, if you have a quarterback on a rookie contract, how much that frees you up in terms of roster construction. So any new owner I would think would be really rooting for Sam Howell to work out this year because that really would solve a lot of problems for you. But you're right. It does, we won't know how a new owner will fare until we know who they choose as coach, as a front office, and how the quarterback thing works out long term.
Right. And so it could be a few years. So, and I think I touched on this a little bit, but is there what would be the top priority for whoever comes in? Is there a number one priority that you would put on that at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm not a fan of Ron Rivera being in charge of both personnel and coaching. I think it would be in my mind, finding a strong, capable, experienced personnel person, and maybe experienced is wrong. They've had people in the building who could do this job, and let them go. So I feel like somebody who understands roster construction, and that to me is slightly ahead of who's the head coach, because I just don't feel like, Dan famously, when he hired Rivera, was like, oh, the model that works is the coach-centric model, and he plucked the guy on the street and said, you're available, you've never done the other side of this, but I'm going to give you both jobs. I've always thought that was backwards. So I would go with personnel guy as my top pick.
And I think I love that point because, and it's funny because even after that, I talked to somebody who was a longtime coaching agent who's like, I don't want my clients having that role. It doesn't work. So I do, I think it's too much. It's a very difficult role, and there's so much you have to get right with it. But I also, like Barry, the last thing too, like one of the things that has kind of bothered me with this organization over the years is how important is it to have Credo, a philosophy with what you believe in? Because I don't think that they really ever had one here. It was always because I remember asking, we had an assignment for ESPN years ago where it's like, what is your credo? And it's like, well, we just want to win. That's not a credo. That's a result. Like credo is like the journey to get to that result. Right. And so the Steelers, what they believe in, what the Patriots believe, things like that. So how important is that in your mind?
Well, I think it's hugely important, and it was limited by who the owner was because you felt like you're steering. Okay, we'll do this because that didn't work. Oh, that didn't work. We'll go back this direction. Offensive head coach, defensive head coach. The guy who was the quarterback's coach for the Seattle Seahawks will make him the head coach. It just is. There's never been a consistency, and then there's never been. Mike Shanahan was here for 4 years. Jay Gruden was here for 5th. I don't think Jay is a really fun person to talk to and really funny, but I don't think he's the kind of person who sets the tone for an organization. So when a new owner takes over, identifying here's a person with beliefs about personnel and roster construction and how we set the tone in that way. And here's another person who can work in conjunction with them, who's running the football team and building a staff and saying, this is what we believe in, and having those two things fit. That's enormously important. And it has to be, you have to make the right choice so that in 3 years, you're not like, well, I mean, this guy's in the last year of his 4-year deal. We can't really extend him because he hasn't been successful, but we don't want to fire him yet because, they constantly find themselves in that. And then you lay over that the problem with different regimes inheriting the quarterback, which happened, with Ron on the way in because Haskins was left over, and all of that stuff. You've got to get on the same. Everybody has to be on the same page, from ownership, personnel people to coaching staff.
Yeah, because even that one, like, incoming coaches always convince themselves or the owner that, yeah, like Jay was like, yeah, I can make it work with Robert. And you knew within a couple months of him being here that kind of had his doubts. And I think with Rivera came in, they had the same thing with Haskins. And then early in the season, actually they felt pretty good for a part of the year. Then it was like after, early in the season where it kind of changed. So I think that's very important as well. So, we'll see. But, Barry, it's going to be interesting to watch what happens. And, do you have any comms or anything you need to plug coming up?
Well, I got the Masters in a couple of weeks. Opening day is for the baseball team, and it's next to 100 loss season is next week. So a few baseball columns before that, and I am on call for if there is Commanders news. So I will see you in Ashburn if we have something to discuss.
Yeah, and it's funny because this a couple of years ago that the Nats won the series. I'm like, these guys are 3-13, and it's funny because this team still dominates discussion in this town.
Yep.
But it'd be, I think, for the fan base, it'd be nice to get back to talking about it in a different way. So we'll see what happens, Barry. Thanks a lot. Great guest, and appreciate your insights. It was terrific.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Barry for joining me, and thank you, as always, for listening. I'll be back Thursday night / Friday with another podcast, another YouTube video. So I'll talk to you next time.